I remember the exact moment my son finally said her name to me, and I wish I could explain how quiet the room suddenly became after that. It was not dramatic. There were no cameras, no headlines, no grand announcement that would make people stop and stare. It was just a mother sitting across from her son, watching the exhaustion behind his eyes, watching a man who had spent most of his life trying to build the future while quietly losing pieces of himself in the process. And then, after years of hearing him avoid certain conversations, after years of watching him protect his heart with work, logic, deadlines, and impossible ambitions, he finally looked at me differently that night. Softer, slower, almost afraid, and when he spoke her name, I realized something that honestly broke my heart a little. My son was no longer searching for attention, he was searching for peace. There is a very big difference between the two, and most people never understand it, until life humbles them enough to feel lonely in a crowded room. Have you ever loved someone so deeply that you stopped caring about appearances and only prayed they would finally feel safe? Because that is what motherhood becomes eventually. Not control, not expectations, just a quiet prayer that your child finds someone who sees the part of them the world ignores. Before I continue, I want to ask you something gently tonight. If these conversations about love, family, and emotional truth touch your heart in some way, leave a soft like so I know you are here with me. Subscribe if you enjoy these late-night reflections, because I truly believe women understand love stories differently after 50. Tell me where you are watching from, and what time it is where you are right now, because I always imagine us sitting together having tea while we talk about these things. And if this conversation reminds you of someone you love deeply, share it with a friend or family member who may need to hear it tonight. Sometimes the smallest emotional reminder reaches a heart at exactly the right moment. You know, people think mothers stop worrying once their sons become successful. That is one of the biggest misunderstandings in the world. Success does not protect the heart. Wealth does not prevent loneliness. Intelligence does not make someone emotionally safe. If anything, I think brilliant men sometimes become even harder to love because they spend so much of their lives inside their own minds. And my son, oh, he has always lived in his mind more than anywhere else. Even as a little boy, there was this distance in him, not coldness. Never coldness. People misunderstand that too. He felt everything deeply, but he processed emotions privately, quietly, like someone trying to solve feelings instead of simply experiencing them. And as his mother, I learned very early that you cannot force a sensitive soul to open. You can only create enough safety for them to eventually choose honesty on their own. I used to wonder what kind of woman would ever truly understand him. Not the public version of him. Not the headlines. Not the internet mythology surrounding him. I mean the real human being underneath all of it. The exhausted man who sometimes forgets to rest. The man who carries responsibility like armor because he fears what happens if he slows down. The man who still, even now, occasionally speaks like a little boy trying to explain the universe before anyone interrupts him. I would sit alone sometimes and think, what kind of woman could hold space for that without trying to change him? Because many people are attracted to extraordinary men, but very few are emotionally equipped to live beside one. Do you agree with me? I think admiration is easy. Real partnership is not. There were years when I worried that my son confused emotional intensity with emotional compatibility. That happens to many intelligent people. They mistake chemistry for peace. They mistake fascination for trust. And women over 50 understand this better than anyone, because by our age, we have already learned that excitement alone cannot sustain love. Attraction may open the door, but emotional safety is what keeps two people together when life becomes difficult. I wanted my son to find a woman who understood silence. A woman who did not need constant performance to feel valued. Someone who could sit beside him during the heaviest moments without demanding that he become smaller, softer, less ambitious, or easier for the world to digest. Can I ask you something personal tonight? Have you ever watched someone you love achieve everything except emotional rest? It is one of the strangest forms of heartbreak, because from the outside everyone assumes they must be happy. People see accomplishment, and imagine fulfillment automatically follows. But mothers notice different things. We notice tired eyes. We notice delayed replies. We notice when laughter becomes shorter. We notice when someone starts using work to avoid emotional vulnerability. And there were moments, many moments, when I looked at my son and thought, you are surrounded by people, but who truly knows you? I think that question haunted me more than anything else. And then, slowly, something began changing in him. It was subtle at first. A mother notices energy before words. The tension in his shoulders softened slightly. His voice became calmer in private conversations. He seemed less emotionally reactive, less restless. It was not happiness exactly. It was something deeper. Stability, the kind that enters a person's life when they no longer feel emotionally alone. I remember hearing him mention her indirectly, long before he said her name openly. Tiny references, small observations. The kind of details a man only notices when a woman has begun affecting his inner world quietly. And every mother recognizes those signs immediately. He once paused during a conversation and said, "She listens differently." Now most people would miss the importance of that sentence completely. But I did not. Because men like my son spend their entire lives being heard publicly but rarely understood privately. There is a difference. One fills rooms, the other heals hearts. That sentence stayed with me for days afterward. She listens differently. I kept thinking about what he truly meant by that. I think he meant she listened without trying to compete, without trying to impress him, without trying to manage his image. She listened like someone who cared more about the human being than the public figure. And honestly, that made me emotional because powerful men are often loved for what they provide, represent or symbolize, not for who they actually are beneath all the noise. Do you know what I believe mature love really is? I think mature love is emotional gentleness during moments when someone has nothing left to prove. Not performative romance. Not dramatic declarations. Just a feeling of safety that slowly teaches the nervous system to rest. Women our age understand this deeply, because life eventually strips away illusions. We stop chasing fantasy, and start craving peace. We stop asking, "Is this exciting?" and begin asking, "Can I breathe around this person?" Those are very different questions. I used to pray for a woman who would not fall in love with my son's image before understanding his burdens. Because the truth is, loving a man with enormous responsibilities requires emotional maturity most people never develop. It requires patience when stress changes his mood. It requires confidence when public attention becomes overwhelming. It requires compassion when exhaustion makes him distant. And above all, it requires the ability to love someone without trying to possess them completely. That is where many relationships fail. People want ownership instead of connection. One evening, not long before he finally said her name aloud, I asked him something carefully. I said, "When you imagine growing older now, do you still picture yourself alone?" And he became very quiet. That silence told me more than words ever could. Because for years, I think my son accepted loneliness as the price of greatness. He believed extraordinary goals required emotional sacrifice, and perhaps part of that was true. But no mother wants her child to believe they must suffer forever in order to matter. I certainly did not want that for him. Deep down, I still wanted him to experience ordinary love in the middle of an extraordinary life. Someone waiting for him at the end of impossible days. Someone who cared whether he slept enough. Someone who could remind him he was human before he was important. Have you ever loved a man who struggled to separate his value from his productivity? That is one of the saddest things to witness, because those men secretly believe they must constantly earn rest, affection, even tenderness. They do not know how to simply receive love without proving themselves first. And mothers see that wound early. We see the little boy underneath the accomplished man. The night he finally told me her name, there was no arrogance in him, no certainty. That surprised me most. People assume powerful men approach love with confidence, but often it is the opposite. The more they have experienced disappointment, the more fragile genuine feelings become. He looked almost vulnerable saying her name aloud, as though speaking it made the possibility real in a frightening way. I remember smiling softly because I could hear something hidden underneath his voice, hope. And hope is terrifying when someone has been hurt before. I asked him, "What makes her different?" He leaned back quietly for a long moment before answering. And what he said next stayed with me deeply. "She doesn't seem interested in controlling me." Such a simple sentence, yet it carried years of emotional exhaustion inside it. I think many women misunderstand ambitious men completely. They believe love means reshaping them emotionally into something easier to manage. But truly driven people cannot be loved through control. They can only be loved through understanding. That does not mean accepting unhealthy behavior. It means recognizing that some souls are built with enormous internal pressure already. They do not need another battlefield waiting at home. I could see relief in my son's face while speaking about her. Not obsession, not infatuation, relief. And perhaps that is one of the purest forms of love later in life. Finding someone whose presence lowers your emotional defenses, instead of constantly activating them. Tell me honestly, have you ever met someone who made you feel calmer, instead of more confused? Because I think women over 50 know exactly how rare that is. At our age, we no longer romanticize emotional chaos the way younger people often do. We understand peace is precious. We understand consistency matters. We understand emotional reliability becomes deeply attractive after surviving enough disappointment. As he continued speaking about her, I noticed something else. He was careful, protective. He did not speak about her like a trophy or fantasy. He spoke about her like someone he genuinely feared losing, and strangely enough, that comforted me. Because men protect what they truly value emotionally. They become quieter about it, more intentional, less performative. There is something heartbreaking about realizing your child is finally ready for the kind of love they once resisted. Mothers carry memories their children forget. I still remember him as a little boy sitting alone with books while other children played loudly outside. I remember his sensitivity, even when he tried hiding it. I remember moments he felt misunderstood. And perhaps that is why this mattered so much to me. Because underneath all the success, intelligence and ambition, I still saw the same boy hoping someone would understand him, without requiring explanation after explanation. Do you know what I asked him next? I asked, does she make your life feel lighter, or heavier? And again he became quiet. That question matters more than people realize. Many relationships begin with excitement, but slowly become emotional weight. Real love should not constantly feel like survival. Mature love should create softness in places life hardened. It should reduce loneliness instead of intensifying it. When he finally answered me, his voice was almost a whisper. She makes things quieter in my head. I cannot explain the emotion that moved through me hearing that sentence. I think every mother wants to know her child has finally found emotional shelter somewhere in this difficult world. Not perfection. Shelter. Someone who helps silence the internal storms temporarily. And suddenly I understood why he had waited so long before saying her name aloud to me. There is a certain expression a mother recognizes instantly, when her son has crossed from curiosity into genuine emotional attachment. It is not excitement. It is not obsession. It is not even happiness in the way most people imagine. It is vulnerability. Quiet vulnerability. The kind that appears when someone finally realizes another person now has the power to hurt them deeply, because they matter deeply. And after my son spoke her name that night, I kept thinking about the strange tenderness in his eyes. I had not seen that softness in him for a very long time. Powerful men learn to protect themselves emotionally, in ways most people never notice. They become disciplined with affection, careful with trust, calculated with emotional exposure. But love, real love, slowly dismantles those defenses without asking permission first. I remember sitting there watching him, wondering if he understood how transparent he suddenly became to me. Mothers always know. Even when our children believe they are hiding their emotions well, we know. We hear it in the pauses between sentences. We see it in the way they avoid direct eye contact, when feelings become too real. We notice how carefully they speak someone's name, when that person has entered their heart completely. And the way my son spoke about her that evening, told me something important immediately. This was no longer about attraction. This was about emotional safety. That changes everything. You know, younger people often believe love is supposed to feel dramatic all the time. They think constant intensity means passion. But women our age understand something different. We understand that sustainable love often arrives quietly. It feels less like fireworks, and more like exhaling after years of tension. It feels like finally setting down emotional armor you became too tired to carry. And I think that is exactly what frightened my son most. Not the possibility of losing her someday, but the realization that he no longer wanted to live emotionally isolated anymore. Have you ever watched someone spend years pretending they do not need companionship, only to realize they were lonely the entire time? It is heartbreaking because pride often disguises emotional hunger. Some people bury themselves in work, achievements, schedules, obligations or distractions because stillness forces them to confront what is missing. And my son, he has always known how to outrun stillness. He fills silence with ideas, plans, impossible goals, technological visions, endless responsibility. But eventually even brilliant minds become exhausted from carrying emotional loneliness privately. That night, I asked him something I had wondered for years. I said, "Do you think she understands how difficult your life truly is?" And he surprised me with his answer. "No," he said quietly. "I think she understands how difficult I am." I actually laughed softly after hearing that because it was such an honest response. And honesty matters more than perfection in relationships. Too many people enter love, wanting to be admired, instead of understood. But admiration fades when reality arrives. Understanding is what survives difficult seasons. I think women over 50 know this intimately because by now we have seen relationships collapse under ego, pride, emotional immaturity, and unrealistic expectations. We have watched couples who looked perfect publicly destroy each other privately. We have learned that compatibility is not built on appearances. It is built on emotional endurance, on whether two people can survive each other's difficult moments without losing tenderness completely. And I could feel my son slowly beginning to believe that perhaps he had finally met someone capable of that. Do you know what touched me most? It was not how highly he spoke about her beauty or intelligence, though he clearly admired both. It was the small emotional details he noticed, the deeply human details. He talked about how she reacted when he was exhausted. He talked about the way she remained calm during stressful moments. He mentioned how she never pressured him to become emotionally performative for reassurance. Those things may sound ordinary to some people, but they are not ordinary to emotionally overwhelmed men. They are rare, because many people say they want ambitious partners until they experience what ambition actually costs emotionally. They do not realize extraordinary responsibility often creates extraordinary exhaustion. And exhausted people are not always easy to love perfectly every day. Sometimes they become distant. Sometimes they withdraw mentally. Sometimes they struggle to transition from problem-solving mode into emotional presence. A mature woman understands this without immediately personalizing every difficult moment. Can I ask you something tonight? Have you ever felt emotionally lonely inside a relationship even though the other person technically loved you? That kind of loneliness changes people slowly. It teaches them to stop asking for deeper connection, because disappointment becomes too painful. And I think my son experienced enough emotional disappointment over the years that part of him genuinely stopped expecting peace from love. He expected attraction, he expected chemistry, he expected intensity, but peace. I do not think he trusted peace anymore. Until her. As he continued talking, I noticed something incredibly meaningful. He never once described her in terms of status, image, or how she appeared publicly beside him. Not once. He spoke about how she affected his internal world instead. That is when I knew this relationship had entered a deeper emotional place than perhaps even he fully realized yet. I asked him carefully, "What happens when the two of you disagree?" That question matters tremendously, because conflict reveals more than romance ever will, and he smiled slightly before answering. She listens first. Such a simple answer again, yet so emotionally revealing. Do you know how rare it is for highly driven people to feel genuinely heard during conflict? Most arguments become competitions instead of conversations. People stop listening and begin defending themselves emotionally. But emotionally mature women understand that listening during tension is one of the purest forms of love. Not surrendering. Not avoiding honesty. Simply listening with the intention to understand instead of dominate. I remember feeling emotional hearing him describe that because my son has spent so much of his life in environments where everyone wants something from him. Attention, decisions, solutions, leadership, expectations surround him constantly. So when he described a woman whose energy felt emotionally non-demanding, I finally understood why she mattered to him differently. She gave him space to remain human. And perhaps that sentence alone explains why some relationships survive while others collapse. Women sometimes ask me what kind of woman powerful men truly need. The answer may surprise many people. They do not need another source of pressure waiting at home. The world already exhausts them. They need emotional steadiness. They need sincerity. They need someone capable of loving them privately, without competing with their public identity constantly. That does not mean losing yourself for a man. Never. A woman should never disappear emotionally inside someone else's life. But mature love understands balance. It understands timing. It understands when to push and when to comfort. Younger people often think love is about constant emotional stimulation. Older women know love is also about emotional regulation. Sometimes the greatest act of love is creating peace, where someone expects conflict. And slowly, while listening to my son that evening, I realized something painful about his past relationships too. Many people had loved the idea of him without fully understanding the emotional cost of his world. They were drawn toward the intensity, the ambition, the attention surrounding him. But very few people seemed emotionally prepared for the reality underneath all of it. Real love begins after fascination fades. That is where truth starts. I leaned toward him gently and asked, "Are you afraid?" He looked down for several seconds before answering. Yes, there it was. Not fear of commitment, not fear of losing freedom, fear of emotional dependence. That is a completely different kind of fear, because once someone becomes emotionally important enough to affect your peace, they also become capable of affecting your pain, and intelligent people understand this deeply. They calculate emotional risk the same way they calculate everything else, especially after heartbreak. I remember touching his hand softly then, because suddenly I no longer saw the accomplished man the world obsesses over. I saw my child again, the sensitive little boy who always felt things more deeply than he admitted aloud. And I said something to him I hope every woman listening tonight remembers forever. I told him, the right woman will never punish you for becoming emotionally honest. I believe that deeply. Emotionally mature love does not weaponize vulnerability. It protects it. It creates safety around it. That is why trust matters more than chemistry eventually. Because chemistry may open hearts temporarily, but trust determines whether those hearts remain open safely over time. Tell me honestly, do you think modern relationships still value emotional safety enough? Sometimes I wonder if people have become too distracted by appearances, excitement, and instant gratification to appreciate emotional steadiness anymore. So many relationships now feel performative instead of intimate. People document affection publicly while neglecting emotional closeness privately. And perhaps that is why so many people feel lonely even while technically being loved. My son continued speaking about her long into the night. Not excessively, not dramatically, but sincerely. And sincerity from emotionally guarded people means everything. At one point I asked him, "Does she know how much she matters to you?" He smiled in that quiet way men smile when emotions become difficult to explain. "I think she knows enough," he said. Enough. That word stayed with me afterward, because mature love often speaks through subtlety instead of grand declarations, especially for people who struggle expressing vulnerability openly. Sometimes love appears through consistency, through concern, through emotional reliability, through remembering small details, through staying during difficult seasons, and perhaps women over 50 understand this better than anyone, because by our age, we have finally learned to recognize love beyond performance. I began imagining the kind of future my son might finally be emotionally ready for now. Not a perfect future. Perfection destroys intimacy because it leaves no room for humanity. I imagined ordinary mornings, shared exhaustion, quiet dinners after difficult days, someone reminding him to rest, someone making him laugh unexpectedly when stress becomes too heavy, someone who understands that even strong men sometimes need softness without judgment. Do you know what mothers secretly hope for more than anything? Not wealthy partners, not impressive partners, not socially admired partners. We hope our children find someone kind during unguarded moments, because character reveals itself privately, not publicly, and the more he spoke about her, the more I sensed kindness in her presence indirectly, not weakness. Kindness and weakness are completely different things. Mature kindness requires emotional intelligence. It requires restraint, patience, self-awareness, compassion. Those qualities become priceless later in life. I asked him one final question before the night ended. I said, "When you imagine losing everything someday, would you still want her beside you?" He answered immediately this time, yes. No hesitation. That answer almost brought tears to my eyes, because I knew then this was no longer about admiration, attraction, or convenience. It was love stripped of performance. Love separated from status. Love connected directly to emotional existence itself. And suddenly I understood why he had protected this relationship so carefully for so long. Because for the first time in years, my son was no longer trying to impress a woman. He was trying not to lose one. There is something deeply emotional about watching your child finally reach the point where love matters more to them than pride. I do not think people realize how difficult that is for someone who has spent years surviving through control, logic, and emotional self-protection. Men like my son are taught by the world to stay productive, stay strong, stay useful. Vulnerability becomes dangerous because too many people misunderstand it, misuse it, or turn it into weakness later. So when I saw him slowly lowering those emotional walls for one woman, I knew this was not temporary. Temporary feelings do not soften a guarded soul that way. After our conversation that night, I sat alone for a very long time, thinking about the little boy he used to be. Mothers carry memories quietly. Even when our children become adults, even when the world sees power and accomplishment, we still remember the moments nobody else saw. I remembered him sitting alone for hours, thinking deeply while other children played outside. I remembered how sensitive he actually was beneath all the intensity, and I remembered the sadness he sometimes carried after disappointment, though he rarely expressed it openly. Sensitive boys often become emotionally guarded men, because they learn very early that the world is not always gentle with soft hearts. That is why this mattered so much to me. For years, I worried my son would continue choosing relationships that looked exciting publicly, but felt exhausting privately. There is a difference between being emotionally stimulated and emotionally nourished. Younger people confuse those things constantly. They chase intensity, because intensity feels powerful in the beginning, but intensity without peace eventually drains the spirit. Mature women understand this after enough life experience. We stop asking whether someone gives us butterflies, and begin asking whether someone gives us emotional stability. And finally, I felt my son beginning to understand that too. The next morning, after he told me her name, I could still hear his voice in my mind, not the words themselves, but the feeling underneath them, hope mixed with fear. That combination only appears when someone truly matters. Have you ever noticed that? People become careless with temporary connections, but when love becomes real, suddenly every emotion feels heavier, every possibility feels fragile, every disagreement matters more, because now there is something meaningful to lose. I think that is why emotionally intelligent love requires courage, not dramatic courage, quiet courage. The courage to trust someone with the softer parts of yourself after life has already disappointed you enough times to become cautious. The courage to remain emotionally honest when it would be easier to retreat behind independence. The courage to let another person affect your peace. That last one is especially difficult for powerful people. My son has spent most of his life trying to solve impossible problems. He understands systems, pressure, deadlines and risk better than most people ever will. But love does not behave logically. You cannot engineer emotional safety through intelligence alone. You cannot control genuine connection completely. And perhaps that is why love humbles even the strongest people eventually. It forces them into emotional uncertainty. I remember asking him softly a few days later, "Do you think she understands how deeply you feel things?" And he smiled a little before saying something that stayed with me. "She notices things I never explain." That sentence touched me more than he probably realized. Because being deeply understood without constantly needing to explain yourself is one of the rarest forms of intimacy in the world, especially for people who struggle expressing emotions directly. Some individuals communicate love through details instead of declarations, through presence instead of speeches, through consistency instead of dramatic romance, and I think she understood his language emotionally. Women over 50 understand something younger women sometimes learn too late. People reveal themselves through patterns, not promises. Anyone can speak beautifully in the beginning. Real character appears during stress, disappointment, exhaustion, conflict, and ordinary routines. That is where lasting love is built or destroyed. And strangely enough, the more my son spoke about her, the less he sounded fascinated, and the more he sounded peaceful. That difference means everything. Fascination is emotional excitement. Peace is emotional trust. One fades quickly, the other deepens slowly. Can I ask you something tonight? Have you ever met someone who made you feel emotionally safe enough to become softer again? Not weaker, softer. There is a difference. Life hardens people over time, especially after heartbreak, betrayal, disappointment, or loneliness. We become protective of ourselves, careful, sometimes even emotionally unavailable without meaning to be. But the right person slowly reintroduces gentleness into places pain once occupied. I believe that is what was happening to my son. And honestly, as his mother, it relieved something inside me I had carried for years. Because no matter how successful your child becomes, part of you still worries about who sits beside them when life becomes difficult. Public admiration cannot comfort someone during private exhaustion. Fame cannot replace emotional intimacy. Achievement cannot hold someone at night when loneliness becomes unbearable. Human beings still need love,